Part 4, COVID-19 as a plague of capitalism. If Zizek thus registers his hope that the social and political dynamics triggered by the pandemic could lead to a rebirth of the communist ideal of sorts, the American social historian Mike Davis is perhaps the most meticulous in making the case that the outbreak of the pandemic itself can be blamed on global capitalism. He does so in his spring update of his 2005 book, The Monster at Our Door, which had focused on the avian flu. The new version is titled, even more evocatively, The Monster Enters, COVID-19, avian flu, and the plagues of capitalism. In it, he sets the current crisis in the context of previous viral catastrophes, notably the 1918 influenza disaster that in just 3 months killed at least 40 million people, and the avian flu of a decade and a half ago that sounded a tocsin, disastrously ignored by those in power for today's devastating outbreak. As his publishers boast, Davis's book exposes the key roles of agribusiness and the fast food industries, abetted by corrupt governments and a capitalist global system careening out of control in creating the ecological preconditions for a plague that has brought much of human existence to a juddering halt. Davis makes the argument that our new age of plague, like previous pandemics, is directly the result of economic globalization. He points out that the Black Death, for instance, was the inadvertent consequence of the Mongol conquest of Inner Eurasia, which allowed Chinese rodents to hitchhike along the trade routes from northern China to Central Europe and the Mediterranean. Likewise, he insists, today, multinational capital has been the driver of disease evolution through a variety of processes, which he analyzes in some depth, including the burning or logging out of tropical forests, the proliferation of factory farming, the explosive growth of slums, and concomitantly of informal employment, and the failure of the pharmaceutical industry to find profit in mass-producing lifeline antivirals, new generation antibiotics, and universal vaccines. In his analysis of the avian flu threat, he emphasizes how a mutant influenza of nightmarish virulence, evolved and now entrenched in ecological niches recently created by agro-capitalism, is searching for the new gene or two that will enable it to travel at pandemic velocity through a densely urbanized and mostly poor humanity. Human-induced environmental shocks, he notes, such as overseas tourism, wetland destruction, a corporate livestock revolution, and third world urbanization with the attendant growth of mega slums, are responsible for turning influenza's extraordinary Darwinian mutability into one of the most dangerous biological forces on our besieged planet. Likewise, he adds, our terrifying vulnerability to this and other emergent diseases has been shaped by concentrated urban poverty, the neglect of vaccine developments by a pharmaceutical industry that finds infectious disease unprofitable, and the deterioration, even collapse, of public health infrastructures in some rich as well as poor countries. Indeed, Davis's scorn for the role of big pharma is quite intense. In a denunciatory vein, he insists products that actually cure or prevent disease, like vaccines and antibiotics, are less profitable, so infectious disease has largely become an orphan market. To this end, he quotes Nature writer Martin Lieb, who points out, from a marketing standpoint, antibiotics are the worst sort of pharmaceutical because they cure the disease. In sum, Davis concludes, the giants prefer to invest in marketing rather than research, in rebranded old products rather than new ones, and in treatment rather than prevention. Towards the end of his book, Davis summarizes the main political economic factors that together provide the preconditions for a new age of pandemic disasters as follows. Quote, the two global changes that have most favored the accelerated cross-species evolution of novel influenza subtypes and their global transmission have been the livestock revolution of the 1980s and 1990s, part of the larger world conquest of agriculture by large-scale agro-capitalism, and the Industrial Revolution in South China, the historical crucible of human influenzas, which has exponentially increased the region's commercial and human intercourse with the rest of the world. The emergence of third world super cities and their slums, then, would constitute a third global condition for potential pandemic spread and virulence evolution. But there's also a fourth negative element that closes the ominous circle of influenza ecology, the absence of an international public health system corresponding to the scale and impact of economic globalization. The absence of an adequate global public health infrastructure as a problem is compounded by the capture of the US political system by nefarious vested interests, including not only big pharma, but also the military industrial complex with its Orwellian war on terror priorities. In this vein, Davis quips that the US is better equipped to deal with the imaginary anthrax and Ebola attacks than with an avian flu influenza pandemic. Meanwhile, not the slightest effort has been made to protect the truly poor countries of Asia and Africa from the return of history's greatest killer. Along lines that would seem to concretize Mbembe's plea for a universal right to breathe, Davis advocates that access to lifeline medicines, including vaccines, antibiotics, and antivirals, should be a human right, universally available at no cost. And echoing Zizek, he adds, if markets can't provide incentives to cheaply produce such drugs, then governments and nonprofits should take responsibility for their manufacture and distribution. In an unabashedly normative, even utopian vein, he emphasizes the survival of the poor must at all times be accounted a higher priority than the profits of big pharma. But he doesn't leave it there. Instead, he takes up the question of anti-capitalist tactics and strategies for the current conjuncture. He argues, quote, capitalist globalization now appears to be biologically unsustainable in the absence of a truly international public health infrastructure. But such an infrastructure will never exist until social movements break the power of big pharma and for-profit healthcare. He continues, this requires an independent socialist design for human survival that goes beyond an updated New Deal. Since the days of Occupy, socialists have put the struggle against income and wealth inequality on page one. A great achievement to be sure, but now we must take the next step of advocating social ownership and the democratization of economic power, with the healthcare and pharmaceutical industries as immediate targets. To this end, he cautions against the widespread virus of US nationalism, its contamination of the priorities and objectives of the US left. In his words, quote, the left must also make an honest evaluation of our political and moral weaknesses. As excited as I have been about the leftward evolution of a new generation and the return of the word socialism to political discourse, there's a disturbing element of national solipsism in the US progressive movement that is symmetrical with the new nationalism. We tend to talk only about the American working class and American radical history, perhaps forgetting that Debs was an internationalist to the core, in what sometimes veers close to a left version of American firstism. What is needed, according to Davis, is a new internationalism on the left. He writes, in addressing the pandemic then, socialists should stress the urgency of international solidarism at every possible occasion. Concretely, we need to agitate our progressive friends and their political idols to demand a massive scaling up of the production of test kits, protective supplies, and lifelong drugs for free distribution to poor countries. It's up to us to ensure that Medicare for all becomes foreign as well as domestic policy. Davis realizes, of course, that such a course of events will be very difficult to achieve. Nonetheless, he warns the alternative is dystopian, indeed not far from Agamben's concerns. In his words, it's inevitable that the right-wing leaders in the White House, Downing Street, Beit Aghion, and elsewhere will seize every opportunity, as they did with 9/11, to appropriate new authoritarian powers, exploiting the consequences of their own inaction and disastrous leadership to set more precedents for closing public spaces, banning assemblies, and even suspending elections. For this very reason, he insists a decidedly left-wing mobilization against the new era of pandemics is an urgent task for social movements. He contends in a message somehow echoing Zizek's. That's why we need to be debating democratic models of effective response to present and future plagues, ones that will have to encourage, put science in command, and use the resources of a comprehensive system of universal health coverage and public medicine. Otherwise, we see leadership in this age of constant emergency to our tyrants. On zoonotic pathogens in the age of the Anthropocene. In an interview he gave in June, the eminent post-colonial theorist Dipesh Chakrabarty would highlight, as had Davis, the very close relationship between deforestation, the destruction of wildlife habitat, and the rise of the threat of new pandemics. According to Chakrabarty, the moment the World Health Organization declared COVID-19 to be a pandemic, the UN officials in their section on environment immediately drew a connection between deforestation, destruction of wildlife habitat, growing human affluence, and the pandemic. Some of them even went so far as to describe the pandemic as nature's warning to humans. They pointed out, and others have too, that in the last 20 or so years, 75% of the new infectious diseases for humans have been of the zoonotic kind, i.e., they originated when a virus or bacteria jumped species, moving from wild animals to humans. This movement of viruses and bacteria from animal or bird bodies to humans has been hastened by the destruction of wildlife habitat, thanks to the increasing pace of deforestation due to mining, logging, road building, conversion of forest to farmland, expansion of human habitations, illegal trade in wildlife products, and so on. Like Davis and Zizek, Chakrabarty too draws implications for the global economic model of a decidedly anti-capitalist slant. He warns, the really critical and fundamental question we have to ask is, do we as humans want to continue expanding an economy that keeps increasing for us the risk of zoonotic diseases? He emphasizes, most recent infections with the potential to cause epidemic or pandemic diseases have been due to increasing human contact with wild animals. Wild animals do not seek us out. We go and destroy their habitat, forcing them to come into contact with us. Many Earth system scientists, evolutionary biologists, and Anthropocene scholars have been reminding us that the global economy is destroying biodiversity and that on human scales of time, biodiversity is a non-renewable resource that is critical to the flourishing of all life, including ours. Therefore, he concludes, it is time we debated the kind of civilization humans would want to live in. He admits that the Cold War battle between capitalism and socialism is well and truly dead, but he insists nevertheless that does not mean that the question of debating capitalism has lost any of its importance. Like Zizek, or for that matter, pretty much everybody on the left, Chakrabarty stops short of advocating a kind of communism of old. He argues the alternative to present-day capitalism does not have to be Maoist or Leninist socialism. What kind of socialism then does he have in mind? A modern and democratic one, he contends, as he puts the point. How to remain modern and democratic and yet not destroy or completely dominate the order of life on the planet remains a critical question as humans contemplate their future of planet they have taken for granted for far too long. Social reproduction, world building, and the pandemic. Feminist scholars, for their part, have emphasized in a way with Mbembe and against Zizek that no, we are not all in the same boat. The social reproduction theorist Alessandra Mezzadri has emphasized how the pandemic has shown the centrality of life-making activities for the working of capitalism. Moreover, it has also shown the value of care, as well as the stark care inequalities experienced by different communities and individuals across the globe. By all means, this is a reproductive crisis like no other before. Mezzadri stresses in an explicitly Mbembean vein that even more so than during business as usual, the necropolitics of capitalism during this pandemic establishes who lives and who dies. In the US, for instance, Black people are far more likely to die of COVID-19. They are poorer and sicker than the rest of the US population, more likely to have diabetes, hypertension, or heart disease, all dangerous comorbidities, and to be turned away from hospitals for lacking private health insurance. The debate on pre-existing health conditions itself has been exclusionary, ableist, and ageist. On the other hand, neoliberal care only interprets the right to live as the survival of the fittest and the most deserving. High rates of death among older people were presented as unavoidable and due to pre-existing health conditions rather than the virus effects. Meanwhile, she warns, across the global south, evidence suggests that hunger and hardship, rather than the pandemic itself, risk killing thousands. Likewise, the Canadian feminist scholars Rita, Gardiner, and Katie Fulfer have stressed the generational disparities and gender dynamics at work in pandemic capitalism, so to speak. They note that in Canada, for example, in the provinces of Ontario and Quebec, serious inequities have emerged concerning care in long-term homes. Close to 80% of deaths from the pandemic are seniors in these homes. They add that many of the homes where the deaths occurred are profit-making centers rather than government-led spaces. Care and profit do not mix well, leading instead to structural injustices that affect those who are most vulnerable in society, which leads them to ask, what is our collective responsibility to eradicate these inequities? They note as well the gender dimension of this problem. In their words, this is not just a health problem, this is also a gendered issue. Many of the older residents of these homes are women. Similarly, most of the carers are women who work in poorly paid jobs, many of which are part-time. On this theme of the so-called essential workers, they further point out that when we order food, delivery, purchase meat, or utilize online businesses such as Amazon to get household necessities without leaving the house, we are staying at home. But we are also part of a web of relations whereby essential workers who work for these companies are often denied a safe working environment. Finally, Gardiner and Fulfer emphasize the way in which the virus seems to have brought out our existential vulnerability and interdependence to the fore. They write, thus, it alerts us to a paradox. That is, our physical health is vulnerable to the new virus, while our mental well-being is vulnerable through increased isolation. They urge in this respect attention to our social connections with others. In their words, while it seems that many are grappling with this paradox of vulnerability, our argument is that the virus and this paradox should also alert us to pay attention to our social connections with others, to take responsibility for structural injustices that occur in the workplace, and to recognize how they affect diverse working lives. They stress in this vein, and similar to Mbembe and Mezzadri, the way in which the virus exploits intersectional inequities. They contend, in particular, what this pandemic has brought to the fore is the gender, race, and other intersectional inequities that can be erased behind our politicians' calls for a collective and dutiful response on the part of citizens. In this spirit, they invoke the legal scholar Kimberly Williams Crenshaw, who has critiqued the language of "we're all in this together" for ignoring racial inequities in the United States. As she highlights, majority Black counties faced 3 times the COVID-19 infection rates and nearly 6 times the mortality rate from the virus than majority white counties did. They therefore conclude, when crises fail to take account of historical and existing power dynamics, solutions might ignore or worsen inequities, such as the US Congress legislative attempts to alleviate economic hardship during the pandemic. To this end, they again invoke Crenshaw, who has traced the government's colorblind pandemic response as stemming from intersectional racism in economic policy in the Great Depression through the 1960s civil rights era to response to disasters such as Hurricane Katrina in 2005. And they end on a call for solidarity along Arendtian lines, a solidarity that must move beyond compliance with government or public health directives. For togetherness, they insist, is not just a feeling of mutuality, but a call to action. Conclusion. Let us therefore conclude. In this lecture, we began with an analysis of the strengths and limits of the Foucauldian paradigm of biopolitics for understanding the social and political dynamics associated with the COVID-19 pandemic. To this end, we analyzed the concept and discussed contemporary invocations of it in interpretations of the dynamic unleashed by COVID, including essays by Giorgio Agamben, Peter Zendi, and Achille Mbembe. We then turned to analyze the claim that COVID-19 is best construed as a plague of capitalism. To do so, we spent time working through arguments advanced by Slavoj Žižek, Mike Davis, and Dipesh Chakrabarti. Finally, we considered social reproduction and Arendtian contributions to the social scientific debate about COVID-19 from feminist scholars such as Alessandra Mezzadri, Rita Gardiner, and Katie Fulfer.